God, may these words, all our meditations this day, be filled with your Spirit, God, because we need you. Amen. Last Sunday night, I texted to confirm Sam's play date the next day. Yeah, the 16-month-old had a play date, but that is an entirely different sermon. It was a marker of my privilege that I didn't expect the response. They couldn't come. There was simply too much going on with their sisters-in-law and their families in Israel. The worry, the fear wafted off of the screen like smoke. Each day this week unfolded similarly in some form or another. Emails about the increased security at the preschool. My children attend Ohavi Zedek's preschool, which is, by the way, truly one of the best gifts of my parental experience so far. But walking in the doors to school, there was always a group in the foyer. Sometimes they were talking in muted tones. So-and-so's child had gotten called up, another hadn't heard. Sometimes they were just standing there to be together. They recounted stories of friends who tried to reach out that sounded like they were from the book of Job. Most amounted to some form of, "You had it coming because of Israel's policies." Now, to be clear, the United Church of Christ issued a declaration for a just peace in Palestine and Israel at its last synod. The text is nuanced and well written, but it does call the government of Israel an apartheid state. This resolution was led by churches here in Vermont. But whether or not you believe that is true, it doesn't negate the fact that "you had it coming" is not a particularly empathetic thing to say to someone who is waiting to hear from a loved one, to someone who's trying to ignore the nationwide threats of violence being issued here in the US in solidarity with Hamas, to people who recall the horrors of the Holocaust that most had someone in their family survive, or not, to people who deliver their babies to school under the watchful eyes of police, and who feel their promised safety of place is again eroding like sand under their feet. My social media feed had much of the same sentiment, as I'm sure yours did too. I lost count of the number of times I scrolled past the words, "It's only complicated if you think apartheid is okay." Both Muslims and Jews reported astounding levels of mistreatment and threatening behaviors this week, some petty and some less so, here in the United States. It's as if we feel like you have to pick which babies you are allowed to mourn. Now, over the past month here at First Church, we've been undertaking a study of creation theology and climate change. We began by examining the ways in which Jewish and Christian scriptures and theology place awe and reverence for all of creation as the foundational understanding of what it means to be human. Then we looked at the ways in which human-caused climate change was coming to its tipping point, as the 195 governments on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last year released the stunning information that unless carbon emissions peak in 2025, and we are able to halve carbon emissions by 2030, unless this happens, we will surpass the maximum survivable temperature for human life on Earth. We looked at climate work as our Christian vocation. On Worldwide Communion Sunday, we looked at what it was in our life that would motivate us to act on this fact. What could compel us to do something, to put ourselves into the ring of politics and activism and personal change? Fireflies at night? I have no idea what that is. Do you all hear that? All right, great. Okay, it's a loose pipe. Thank you, Doug. All right. Grandchildren? What is it? We discussed the primacy of land as not a metaphor for safety, but a reality of safety, right? For displaced peoples who have been the subjects of genocide, land is safety, land is promise, land is just short of the kingdom of God here on earth as it is in heaven. This is true everywhere, of course, for everyone, not just in Israel and Palestine. It's why the housing crisis here is so devastating. Without a place to build your nest, it feels like poverty is always knocking at your door. Now, last week, the reality of that came to life in shocking ways as Hamas attacked Israel on Sukkot, the Jewish holiday where they remember their ancestors had no place to call home and lived in tents. With the brutality of Hamas on display and the ferocity of Israel's wrath and the world's response watching through our screens like we were cheering for sides in a football game, it all came to life in a very different way. Land, creation, connection, it feels like safety until it doesn't. Now, this week, we are meant to be talking about diversity, specifically biodiversity, and the ways it is stitched into the fabric of all good Christian theology. From Paul's understanding that humanity forms the body of God to John's Gospel's understanding that Christ was the incarnate Word, which means the structure of the very universe through whom all things come into being. Now, I thought about scrapping this topic, to be honest, and to speak only on Israel and Palestine. But throughout the week, I was reminded again and again that what has been happening is really the same root. It's a fear-based desire for security that, when pursued through the lens of me and my own, produces unspeakable violence, either to the land or about it. Now, in 1993, the theologian Sally McFaig wrote that the past several hundred years of Protestant theology have gone terribly astray by focusing on individual salvation. When the incarnation, which is the belief that God is here with us on earth, actually goes beyond Jesus of Nazareth to include all matter. God is incarnated in the world. What postmodern science is telling us, she continues, is that the whole universe is a whole, and that all things, living and non-living, are interrelated and interdependent and have been for most of the world's history. Seen as common knowledge. This has been common knowledge for most of the world's history. People living close to the land and to other animals, as well as to the processes that support the health of the land and living creatures, they have known this from their daily experience. We, as a post-industrial urbanized people, alienated from our own bodies, much less the body of the earth, we have to learn it. And most often, it comes to us as a strange knowledge. The scriptures are full of this warning that when we lose our ability to see the fullness of creation, we as a species get into trouble. When our vision narrows to seeing only ourselves or people like us, we become afraid. We shall be scattered, the Babel citizens say. They are afraid. We have been abandoned, the Israelites say. They are afraid. And so we grasp for anything we can hold on to. It's usually our pride. Look at what I can make or I can do. We build altars to ourselves and call them God. Whether it's a tower to our own abilities or a golden statue, the scriptural stories about this are plentiful. And this is also the story of the climate crisis, the worship of things we have created. Devices with a bitten apple, perhaps. Or fuel engines. Comfort, security. These are our golden calves. How many of you panic when you leave your house without your phone? Security, comfort, not in God. According to cognitive neuroscientists, we are conscious of only 5% of what goes on up here. 95% of our functioning, decisions, emotions, behavior, 95% is subconscious. In this light, it makes sense, doesn't it? Our refusal to change in order to save the planet. Because change destabilizes us in ways that bring to the surface all of those unconscious fears. Let us worship instead the idea that we are in control so that we do not have to face that we are profoundly out of control. our mortality, our createdness, and the mess we have made. How much easier it is to stay in the 5%. This is also the story of the Middle East right now. To become so focused on our own safety that the interconnectedness is lost. So a Hamas fighter can fail to see the light of God in the eyes of an Israeli peace activist. And Thomas Friedman can unironically write in the New York Times that he supports the state of Israel because it shares our values, without doing any sort of analysis on how those values might be perceived elsewhere. Are our values states of dual citizenship? Well, yes, but I'm pretty sure that's not what he means. Blinders that keep us safe from facing the 95%. To survive, the eco-psychologist Caroline Hickman writes, to survive, we are going to have to undergo a cultural spiritual awakening. If diversity is the driving goal of life, as has been postulated by biology, Freudian psychology, and our religion alike, then we must find a way as people of faith to be at the forefront of that cultural shift. This is fortunate, however, because to survive in an increasingly warming planet and in a changing climate, we will need to drag two things into the conscious mind. One, our interconnectedness, therefore our vulnerability, and two, our fear. And both of those happen to be central to Christianity. Now, fear we're going to talk about more next week when we talk about anxiety, eco-anxiety. But today, I want to discuss the way liberation theology offers us a critical lens to begin to do this work. How do we bring interconnectedness to the foreground? How do we make that decision to have it be the basis of our faith? Now, McFaig wrote in her book, The Body of God, what would it mean to understand sin as the refusal to share the basic necessities of survival with other bodies? Sin as the refusal to share the basic necessities with other bodies, to see Jesus of Nazareth as paradigmatic of God's love for bodies, to interpret all creation as the myriad forms of matter bodied forth from God and empowered with the breath of life. What if our most basic understanding of sin was refusal to share the basic necessities? Perhaps the gap between CEO and employee pay would return to 20-1, as it was in the 60s, as opposed to 399-1 that it is now. Sinful. Perhaps we'd have fewer landlords charging as much as they can get. Perhaps freedom from would be as important as freedom to. Perhaps we might have more lawsuits like those brought by the 21 youths in Juliana versus the United States, arguing that the actions taken by the government infringe on their right to a livable climate, or those in Ecuador and New Zealand that determine rivers are understood to have many of the same personhood rights as human beings. If sin is the refusal to share basic necessities, if the world is God's body, if you are God's body, if the river is God's body, sin is a little bit easier to see, isn't it? And in 1988, the Peruvian priest Gustavo Gutierrez argued that if we're going to figure out how to hear God and to see God in this world, we have to understand that God has what he calls a preferential option for the poor. If the world is God's body and sin is the hoarding and denial of resources, then to find God in the world, you have to listen to the voices of the poor, the disenfranchised, to hear her speak, the ones who are being denied basic necessities. Which means in most cases, if everyone in the room wants to build a golden calf, there might be some voices you aren't hearing. Or if everybody in the room wants to drive a car and all of the youth are telling you to stop, it might be time to listen. Theirs is where you will hear the voice of God. Caroline Hickman, the psychologist who's done most research on this, thinks we should lower the voting age to 16. Because the youth are the only ones who see clearly what will most impact them. Whose voice do you hear? Those are the voices we drag into our conscious. If this morning's scriptures tell us anything, it is that this is not a new quest, though. As much as it is harrowing to hear that, it's also the good news, because time and time again, we have stories of humanity's abilities to overcome the subconscious and primal fear. That is the scriptural story. Whether it's Moses rising up to say, no, there's a better way, or Jesus saying, my body is your body and your bread, or whether it's the Palestinian peace activist Bassem Aid, who says that in the 21st century, if massacres like those perpetrated by Hamas last week can be considered victories, that means this is the end of our humanity. Or Vivian Silver, an Israeli resident peace activist who served on a board that declared Israel an apartheid state, who was kidnapped by Hamas and whose son maintains that she would be fighting still for peace. Or like Kelsey Juliana, one of the youths who is suing the United States, who says this work must be done out of love. It must be done out of love. Motivation and activism and advocacy cannot come from rage or anger or hopelessness. These feelings are unsustainable, short-lived, and detrimental for those harboring them, which will then most likely be reflected in one's work, and therefore inhibit true and lasting positive change. We cannot push society towards more positive, inclusive, sustainable directions without love as the main driver. John Philip Newell, in his work, The Rebirthing of God, wrote that the real problem that overwhelmingly confronts most of us in the world most of the time is that we are not falling in love. We are not falling in love. We are not falling in love with the heart of one another and the heart of other nations and the hearts of other species. We are blind to their secret beauty. And he quotes Thomas Merton, who wrote, when people are in love, they are more than their everyday selves, more alive, more understanding, more enduring. They are made over into new beings. Our true center is at the heart of one another. This, friends, is the heart of Christianity, what we do in this place. It is the heart of faith itself. It's the heart of the future in the Middle East, and it's the heart of the hope for climate change. Because, as Juliana put it, you cannot burn out of love. Friends, we cannot burn out of love. So let's go fall in love.